Every nation has a flag, a founding date, and a story it tells its children. But America is different because it was not simply born, it was declared. It was argued into existence with words that were so ambitious they sounded reckless, and then those words were carved into law and taught as if they were a promise signed in blood. From the very beginning, the United States wasn't content to be a place on a map. It insisted on being an idea in motion, a living claim about human nature and political power, that ordinary people could rule themselves, that rights could exist before government. That legitimacy came not from ancient bloodlines but from consent. That kind of founding is rare. And it explains why the world has never stopped staring at America, sometimes in admiration, sometimes in fear, sometimes in anger, often in confusion. The United States is not just another nation that happens to be powerful. It is a global outlier, a country that has repeatedly broken expectations, rewritten its own identity, and exported not only products and armies but a worldview. That is why the question, why no other nation is like America, isn't a slogan. It's a real historical puzzle. And to answer it honestly, you have to accept two truths at once. America has achieved things no other nation has achieved in quite the same way, and America has carried contradictions so severe that they have nearly torn it apart. The uniqueness is not a halo. The uniqueness is an intensity, a combination of ideals, institutions, geography, religion, revolution, mobility, and conflict that produced a national character unlike any other on Earth. The term American exceptionalism is often used like a compliment or an insult, depending on who says it, but the phrase itself has an origin story that reveals how complicated America's uniqueness really is. The term was coined in the late 1920s by German Marxists and then used in a bitter communist debate about why the United States didn't behave like Europe. In the Marxist view, industrial capitalism should produce hard class lines, escalating conflict, and eventually revolution. Yet the United States, with its abundant natural resources and expanding economic opportunity, seemed to absorb social pressure in ways that confused European expectations. Some communist thinkers argued that America was exceptional because its natural wealth and industrial capacity softened the class struggle that was supposed to sharpen into revolution. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin condemned that view as heresy and insisted America would follow the same laws of history as everyone else. Then the Great Depression arrived and critics claimed it had shattered the myth, but the phrase survived. It escaped the communist argument and moved into mainstream intellectual life, where it evolved into a larger debate, not whether America would have a communist revolution, but whether America is fundamentally different from other nations in its values, its political system, its historical development, and its role in the world. Few countries have a national identity so contested that even the meaning of their uniqueness becomes a political battleground. In the United States, exceptionalism became more than a descriptive term. It became a kind of national mirror. Americans look into it and argue over what they see. Long before the term existed, foreigners were already noticing something strange about America. Alexis de Tocqueville traveled through the United States in the early 19th century and wrote that the position of Americans was quite exceptional. What he saw was not a people born superior, but a society shaped by unusual circumstances, a Puritan origin that gave moral intensity, commercial habits that drove practicality, political participation that seemed unusually broad for the era, and a social environment that was less rigidly aristocratic than Europe's. Tocqueville described Americans as deeply focused on practical objects, as if the nation's passions, wants, education, and daily life all pulled them earthward toward building and improving. Yet he also noted that religion occasionally forced them to glance upward toward heaven, giving the society a moral frame that could restrain selfishness and inspire purpose. Tocqueville's most important point was not that America was destined to be a model for all democracies, but that you could not understand democracy without understanding America's special conditions. And that is still true. The United States developed in a vast open space, far from Europe's ancient structures but still connected to European ideas. It grew with an unusual mixture of freedom and brutality, equality as an ideal and inequality as a practice. It formed institutions that were modern and stable at a time when much of the world was still governed by monarchy. Those conditions mattered, and they set America on a different trajectory. One of the most influential modern arguments about America's uniqueness comes from political scientist Seymour Martin Lipset, who said the United States is exceptional because it began with a revolutionary event that created the first new nation built around a distinct ideology. Many countries have long histories and inherited identities, but America emerged as a nation defined not by ancestry but by a set of principles: liberty, individualism, republicanism, democracy, meritocracy, and laissez-faire economics. This is sometimes called Americanism, and whether you embrace or criticize it, it is central to the nation's self-conception. America didn't just separate from Britain. It invented a national identity that was meant to be portable, universal, and morally persuasive. The Declaration of Independence didn't only declare freedom for a territory, it declared a theory of rights for humanity. That was a radical act. It meant that from the start America saw itself as more than a local political arrangement. It saw itself as a demonstration. And when a nation thinks it is a demonstration, it behaves differently. It argues differently. It judges itself differently. It justifies its actions differently. It does not easily accept the idea that it is just like everyone else, because to be just like everyone else would be to betray the point of its founding. This ideological founding is one of the clearest answers to why no other nation is like America. Many nations are built on common heritage, language, ethnicity, or religion. The United States, at least in its ideal form, is built on a civic creed. You can join it. You can become it. You can argue with it and still claim it. That is why America's identity is often described as propositional, meaning it is based on a proposition about what government should be. Abraham Lincoln captured this in the Gettysburg Address when he described the nation as conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. That kind of nationhood is uncommon. It makes the United States unusually open to immigrants, at least in theory, because belonging is not supposed to depend on blood. It makes citizenship a moral claim, not just a legal status. It also means that political conflict often feels like a fight over the soul of the country, because the country is defined by ideals that can be interpreted in competing ways. The American political system is another major reason no other nation is quite like America. The United States is built on a deep distrust of concentrated power. Its structure is not designed to make government efficient. It is designed to make tyranny difficult. Federalism divides authority between the states and the national government. Checks and balances divide authority between the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. The result is a system that often frustrates action but prevents domination. This design creates a distinctive political culture. Americans are constantly negotiating power between local and national levels. Laws and policies can vary dramatically across states. Citizens often identify strongly with both their state and their country in a way that is less common in more unitary systems. Supporters of exceptionalism argue this prevents a tyranny of the majority and preserves freedom. Critics argue it can allow local majorities to oppress minorities and can create inequality across the country. Both are true in different periods. But the fact remains, America's political architecture is unusual, and it shapes everything from debates over education and policing to the culture wars that divide the nation today. The U.S. isn't just a democracy. It is a democracy engineered around conflict management, and that engineering shapes the national character. Some scholars argue America's uniqueness is also tied to the relative absence of feudalism and an inherited aristocracy in the European sense. Harvard political scientist Louis Hartz argued that America lacked the left-wing socialist and right-wing aristocratic traditions that shaped European politics, because the colonies did not inherit a full feudal structure with established churches, hereditary nobility, and entrenched landed estates. As a result, American politics developed within a liberal tradition centered on individual rights, private property, and representative government. Even when Americans fight over economic policy, they often do so inside that liberal frame. This helps explain why the United States never developed a major socialist party like some European countries did, and why Americans across the spectrum frequently speak in the language of rights rather than in the language of class. Critics of Hartz argue he oversimplifies America's divisions, and they point out that feudal-like labor relations and hierarchical power persisted in different forms. But even critics often acknowledge that America's political culture contains a distinctive liberal baseline, a default suspicion of centralized authority, and a strong emphasis on individual autonomy. This liberal tradition, however, collided with an enormous contradiction: slavery. And if you want to understand why America is unlike other nations, you cannot treat slavery as a footnote. The United States proclaimed liberty while building an economy that depended on human bondage. It produced constitutional ideals while denying citizenship and basic rights to millions. That contradiction did not merely stain the past, it shaped the country's political development in lasting ways. Some scholars argue that America's history of slavery fractured the working class along racial lines, weakening class solidarity and preventing the emergence of strong labor-based political parties. Where other countries built class-based movements, the United States often built racialized politics. White workers sometimes perceived social policies not as class redistribution, but as racial redistribution, and political entrepreneurs exploited that perception. This helped shape America's distinctive ideological landscape, where debates about welfare, government spending, policing, and education are often entangled with race in ways that outsiders struggle to grasp. In other words, America's uniqueness is partly the product of its deepest moral failure, because the legacy of slavery reshaped the nation's social structure and political possibilities. At the same time, the American story contains another rare element: the ability to turn moral contradiction into constitutional transformation, even if imperfectly and slowly. The Civil War and the Reconstruction Amendments did something profound. They attempted to rewrite the relationship between the individual and the state, making citizenship and equal protection a national guarantee. Birthright citizenship, enshrined in the 14th Amendment, made anyone born in the United States a citizen, an approach that remains unusual among developed nations. This principle reinforces America's civic conception of belonging and deepens its difference from nations that define identity through ancestry. Yet the same legal system that promised equality also allowed decades of Jim Crow and discrimination. Again, America's uniqueness is not clean. It is the intensity of its contradiction. A nation capable of writing universal principles into law and then violating them, and also capable of later using those same principles as weapons against injustice. The American legal tradition became a battleground where the nation fought over whether it would live up to its claims. That fight, unfolding through courts, protests, amendments, and social movements, is part of why America's history feels so dramatic. The country is always, in some sense, putting itself on trial. Religion also plays a distinctive role in America's uniqueness, not simply because Americans have been religious, but because American religiosity has often merged with national purpose. Puritan roots contributed to the idea that America was chosen to be a model, a city upon a hill. Over time, that sense of covenant and destiny blended with Republican ideology. Historians have argued that religious traditionalists embraced Republican virtue, because they believed God was raising America for a particular purpose. This fusion created an American pattern where political questions often carry spiritual weight. Even when America became more diverse religiously, the language of mission persisted. Americans regularly speak as if the nation has a calling, as if its success carries moral responsibility. This can inspire generosity and reform. It can also justify arrogance. It can create a culture where national identity becomes moral identity, and where criticizing America can be treated as heresy rather than debate. That moral intensity is a distinctive feature of American politics, and it is one reason the country's internal arguments often feel like crusades. The frontier experience is another pillar, often cited by proponents of exceptionalism. The argument is that the American frontier shaped individualism, democracy, and mobility because settlers moved into spaces where rigid European institutions had less immediate control and where property ownership was more widespread. The frontier offered the promise of reinvention. If life was narrow or oppressive where you were, you could move. This created a culture of physical mobility and psychological self-making. Other nations had frontiers, but America's was deeply tied to widespread settlement and local governance, and the mythology of free land became a national narrative of opportunity. That narrative is complicated by the violence of expansion and the dispossession of indigenous peoples, but the cultural impact remains. America became a nation that equated freedom with movement and identity with choice. It became a place where leaving was a form of agency. That habit still shapes American life, from the way people relocate for work to the way Americans imagine personal transformation. This frontier and mobility narrative feeds directly into one of the most famous aspects of American uniqueness, the land of opportunity and the American dream. For much of its history, the United States promoted itself as a place where individuals could escape the class and family contexts of their birth. Mobility could mean changing careers, moving to a new region, or rising in social status. The cultural belief that anyone could rise through effort became central to American identity. Critics point out that social mobility in income terms is not always as high as Americans assume, and that inequality can limit opportunity. Others argue that intergenerational mobility remains strong, and that comparisons can be distorted by differences in inequality. But whether the mobility is as high as the myth suggests is not the only point. The point is that the myth itself functions like a national promise. Many countries accept social hierarchy as normal. America treats the promise of upward movement as part of its legitimacy. And when that promise fails, Americans experience it not merely as disappointment but as betrayal. That dynamic, promise, expectation, anger, creates a distinctive political energy that drives everything from populist movements to demands for reform. Now shift from internal uniqueness to global behavior, because America's distinctiveness is not only domestic. The United States has often acted as if it has a special role on the world stage, and that belief has shaped foreign policy. Some scholars and commentators argue that America's global leadership has been genuinely exceptional in moments where it committed resources and sacrifices to build international systems, promote international law, and advance human rights. Others argue that exceptionalism has been used to justify expansion, intervention, and the selective application of norms, what critics call double standards. The debate is not abstract. It is visible in history. The spread of American influence through manifest destiny, the Monroe Doctrine, wars and interventions, support for some democracies and the overthrow of others, the tension between ideals and interests. The very fact that this debate is constant is another mark of America's uniqueness. Many nations pursue interest and rarely pretend otherwise. America often frames interest as morality, which means its failures become moral scandals. When the United States claims to be a force for good, people judge it by that claim. This can weaken credibility, as critics like Joseph Nye warn, because overuse of exceptionalist rhetoric can reduce soft power by alienating allies and making America seem self-righteous. But it can also motivate genuine sacrifice and leadership. America is unique in that it repeatedly tries to reconcile power with virtue, and that attempt, whether successful or hypocritical, shapes how the world experiences the United States. American exceptionalism becomes most controversial when it shifts from being a description of difference into a claim of exemption, the idea that the United States should be above the rules that bind other nations. Critics argue that, especially in the modern era, exceptionalism has sometimes been used to justify unilateralism and selective compliance with treaties or international norms, as if America's unique history and power granted a special immunity. The danger in that way of thinking is not only legal, as if the debate were merely about technicalities in international law. The deeper danger is moral, because exemption is a temptation that corrodes character. When a person believes they are above consequences, their judgment changes, their humility evaporates, and their capacity to hear criticism withers. The same is true for nations. The theologian Reinhold Niebuhr warned that the automatic assumption that America acts for the right can become a path to moral blindness, and it's hard to read American history without seeing why that warning matters. When leaders begin with the certainty that their cause is inherently righteous, they can begin to treat dissent as disloyalty, complexity as weakness, and restraint as betrayal. In foreign policy, that moral certainty can slide into a mindset where outcomes are assumed to justify methods, where collateral damage is dismissed as unfortunate but inevitable, where the nation imagines itself as the indispensable judge of other governments while treating judgment of itself as an insult. In that framework, exceptional quietly stops meaning distinctive and starts meaning unaccountable, and the world's reaction shifts accordingly. Allies begin to wonder whether American partnership is truly mutual or simply a temporary alignment under American terms. Critics begin to see hypocrisy in rhetoric about rules and rights, and adversaries exploit the gap between America's ideals and its actions to weaken its moral influence. Yet there is another side to the story, and it cannot be dismissed as mere propaganda because it is rooted in real historical experience. Many Americans believe their country's power has been essential to resisting tyranny and supporting freedom, and they point to moments when American leadership did not look like arrogance but like sacrifice. In the 20th century, American industrial capacity and military power helped defeat fascism, and afterward American resources helped rebuild shattered nations rather than permanently occupy them. During the Cold War, American strength, military, economic, and cultural, helped contain an expansionist authoritarian rival, and many people living under oppressive regimes saw American influence not as domination, but as a distant possibility of protection or eventual liberation. Even in the realm of human rights, proponents argue that when the United States has led, it has sometimes pulled the international community forward, helping build systems that punish war crimes, constrain aggression, and support democratic transitions. That argument is not that America has always been right, but that without American capacity the world could be more dangerous, because power vacuums are rarely filled by saints. In that view, American exceptionalism is not a certificate of perfection, but an acknowledgement of capability and responsibility. The idea that if the United States is uniquely positioned to shape outcomes, it has a unique obligation to do so, even when doing so is difficult, costly, and unpopular. This is the heart of the exceptionalism debate, and it's why it never ends. Whether America's uniqueness should be understood as responsibility or entitlement, as model or exemption, as inspiration or justification. Responsibility is heavy. Entitlement is seductive. Responsibility says America should lead by example, accepting limits, respecting rules, and understanding that legitimacy must be earned continuously. Entitlement says America should lead because it can, because it must, because it is different, and therefore because it deserves special treatment. Responsibility invites humility. Entitlement invites impatience. Responsibility produces alliances. Entitlement produces dependency and resentment. And because America has always carried both impulses within it, the nation's global role has swung like a pendulum, sometimes closer to principled leadership and sometimes closer to raw assertion, often with different Americans arguing not only about what policy should be, but about what America is. That internal argument becomes visible to the world, and it shapes global perceptions. When America speaks the language of universal rights, people listen closely because they know the words are powerful. But they also watch closely for hypocrisy, because hypocrisy in a nation that claims moral leadership is not just a flaw, it is a betrayal of the story that nation tells the world. Even the criticism of exceptionalism becomes part of the American story, because America is a nation that criticizes itself loudly and publicly, and that habit of self-argument is itself a form of distinctiveness. After Vietnam, many intellectuals and citizens questioned the myth of innocence, as if the country had been forced to confront a darker reflection of its own image. Scholars used social history and statistical analysis to show similarities between America and Europe, pushing back against the idea that American development was fundamentally separate from the broader Western story. Critics pointed to hypocrisy on human rights, inequality, and war, arguing that the language of moral mission sometimes functioned as camouflage for ordinary power politics. And yet the debate did not end. Instead, it became another permanent American habit, to argue about whether the country is declining, whether it is morally worthy of its self-image, whether it is still exceptional, whether it ever was, and what the word exceptional should even mean. The United States is unusual in how publicly it stages these arguments, and how deeply they shape political identity. In some nations, criticizing national myths is socially taboo or politically dangerous. In the United States, criticism can become a mainstream force that reshapes elections, rewrites textbooks, changes laws, and transforms the national conversation. That doesn't mean America always listens well, or that dissent is always welcomed, but the sheer volume and visibility of self-critique is a distinctive feature of American life. There is also a uniquely American tension in how criticism and patriotism collide. In many countries, patriotism is often defined as loyalty to the state, or loyalty to the nation as inherited culture. In the United States, patriotism often operates as loyalty to an ideal, which means criticism can be framed as either betrayal or devotion, depending on how you interpret that ideal. Some Americans see criticism as a refusal to honor the country's achievements. Others see criticism as the very act of honoring America's promise by demanding it live up to its principles. This produces a political culture where people can be intensely patriotic and intensely dissatisfied at the same time, where protest can claim to be a form of patriotism, and where arguments about history are really arguments about identity. The exceptionalism debate becomes, in practice, a debate about whether America's foundational promise is primarily a source of pride or a standard of accountability. And because America's promises are so universal, liberty, equality, government by consent, the standard is always visible. You cannot easily say this is just how our culture is, when your culture claims to be about rights that apply to everyone. So the arguments never disappear. They simply evolve, attaching themselves to new events, new wars, new court decisions, new economic crises, new cultural shifts. Some warn that rejecting exceptionalism becomes preemptive declinism, the assumption that America has no special role and is destined to fall, and that this belief can become self-fulfilling. If a nation's citizens lose confidence in their institutions, their mission, and their ability to shape history, they can withdraw into cynicism or tribalism, turning politics into a bitter contest for short-term advantage rather than a shared project. Others argue that recognizing similarity to other nations is healthy humility, a way of escaping arrogance and learning from the world. Those two instincts, confidence and humility, are not enemies when balanced, but they become dangerous when separated. Confidence without humility becomes arrogance. Humility without confidence becomes paralysis. America's uniqueness is partly that it has tried repeatedly to combine both, to maintain belief in its ideals while acknowledging its failures, to claim leadership while admitting limits, to celebrate its distinctiveness while recognizing it is still human, still flawed, still capable of wrongdoing. That attempt is messy, often inconsistent, but it creates a national culture in which the fight over meaning is constant. And the fact that America sustains this debate publicly, and that the debate shapes elections, policy, and culture, is itself a form of uniqueness. Many nations suppress such debates, or keep them within academic circles, or treat them as purely philosophical. In the United States, the national identity is debated at full volume, on television, in campaigns, in protests, in classrooms, and in the courts. Sometimes this looks chaotic, even self-destructive, but it also reflects something deeply American, the belief that legitimacy comes from argument, that truth is refined through conflict, and that the nation is not finished. America is not a nation that simply exists and endures. It is a nation that constantly explains itself, judges itself, and renegotiates itself. That process is exhausting, and it can produce instability, but it also produces adaptation. And adaptation has been one of America's most powerful advantages over time. So, after all these threads, the answer becomes clearer. No other nation is like America, because no other nation combines these elements in the same way and at the same scale. A founding creed with universal claims, a constitutional system designed to distrust power, a civic identity open, at least in theory, to newcomers, a frontier tradition that linked freedom with mobility and reinvention, a religious moral narrative of mission, a history of slavery and racial division that reshaped class politics and national conflict, and a global role that constantly tests the gap between ideals and actions. America is exceptional not in the sense of being always better, but in the sense of being an outlier, a country that behaves differently because it began differently and believes differently about what it is supposed to be. Its uniqueness includes the best and the worst, the inspiring and the embarrassing, the noble and the brutal. It has been a beacon and a battlefield, sometimes in the same decade, sometimes in the same policy, sometimes in the same speech. And that is precisely why the world keeps watching, because America's experiment does not stay inside America. When America succeeds, it changes what people believe is possible. When America fails, it changes what people fear is inevitable. The United States was built on universal language, and universal language creates universal stakes. When a country says, all men are created equal, it invites every oppressed person on earth to measure it. When it says liberty is a natural right, it invites every prisoner and dissident to look toward it. When it claims to be a model of self-government, it invites every aspiring democracy to study it and every cynic to wait for it to collapse. That is a burden that most nations never volunteer to carry, and it creates a peculiar situation. America can be hated and admired at the same time because people respond not only to American actions, but to what America claims to represent. A small country that violates its ideals may be dismissed as ordinary hypocrisy. A country that claims moral leadership and violates its ideals becomes a global scandal. That does not mean America should stop claiming ideals. It means the claims create obligations. In a sense, America cannot escape exceptionalism because America wrote exceptional expectations into its founding documents and then projected those expectations outward. It created a standard for itself that is larger than any single administration, and the world holds the country to that standard even when Americans would rather not be judged. This is why America can look like a paradox to outsiders. The same nation that funds global humanitarian aid can also wage wars that destabilize regions. The same nation that champions freedom of speech can struggle with polarization and propaganda. The same nation that praises equality can produce inequality that shocks other democracies. The same nation that celebrates immigration can also experience waves of nativism. The same nation that insists on limited government can build enormous military and surveillance capacities. These contradictions do not mean America is uniquely evil or uniquely virtuous. They mean America is uniquely consequential. Its choices have outsized impact. And because the United States has both the language of universal morality and the machinery of immense power, the gap between what it says and what it does becomes one of the central dramas of modern history. Other countries may have gaps between ideals and actions. Few countries have gaps that become global events. Understanding America's uniqueness also requires understanding that the country's identity has always been contested. The idea of a city upon a hill was never unanimously accepted. The meaning of liberty was never uncontested. The boundaries of citizenship were fought over. The role of government was debated. The scope of rights was expanded through conflict. What makes America different is not that it has no divisions, but that its divisions occur inside a nation that insists it is built on an argument rather than a tribe. That creates a kind of permanent tension. America wants to be one people, but it contains many peoples and many visions. It wants to be a model, but it is human. It wants to be free, but it must govern. It wants to avoid tyranny, but it must wield power. This tension makes American history dramatic and sometimes violent, but it also makes it dynamic. The United States has repeatedly changed its own rules, expanded rights, reformed institutions, and redefined belonging. That capacity for reinvention is part of its exceptional trajectory. All of this leads to the most compelling way to end a video titled, "Why No Other Nation is Like America," because the ending shouldn't be a cheer or a scold. It should be a challenge that feels worthy of the story. The mature form of exceptionalism is not bragging. It is stewardship. Pride without responsibility is vanity. Responsibility without pride is joyless self-hatred. The American experiment has always required a balance, to appreciate what has been built while insisting on what remains to be built. America is not unique because it is perfect. It is unique because it insists that ideas matter, that government must justify itself, that people can argue their way toward a better future, and that history can be challenged instead of obeyed. The country's greatness is not guaranteed, and its mission is not automatic. It has to be earned again and again by choosing humility over arrogance, example over exemption, and reform over denial. It has to be earned by remembering that the most dangerous form of exceptionalism is not the belief that America is different, but the belief that difference excuses wrongdoing. The most powerful form of exceptionalism is the belief that difference creates obligation, that if the United States claims to be a defender of liberty, it must defend liberty honestly, including at home. If it claims to be a champion of equality, it must confront inequality rather than explain it away. If it claims to be a guardian of law, it must respect law even when it is inconvenient. If it claims to lead, it must lead in a way that others can follow without losing their dignity. If America is a city upon a hill, it is not because it cannot fall. It is because it can be seen. It is because its choices are visible, magnified by power and by the universal language of its founding promises. A city on a hill cannot hide its corruption. It cannot hide its hypocrisy. But it also cannot hide its courage when it chooses to correct itself. The light in that metaphor is not automatic. It is not guaranteed by geography or wealth or military strength. It is fed by civic virtue, by institutional integrity, by the willingness to accept criticism, by the capacity to repair what is broken without abandoning what is true. And that is the deeper reason no other nation is like America. Because America is a nation that was founded as a promise so bold that it still haunts the world, and a promise so demanding that it still haunts Americans too. The world keeps watching not just because America is powerful, but because America claimed from the beginning that power should serve principle. Whether that claim becomes a reality is the continuing test of the American experiment, and the reason its story remains unfinished. America's uniqueness, then, is not a trophy. It is a responsibility that never goes away. It is the responsibility of a nation that has repeatedly influenced the global trajectory of freedom and force, of law and war, of prosperity and inequality, of inclusion and exclusion. And if there is one final note to leave your audience with, it is this: the debate over American exceptionalism will never be settled by a slogan, because it is really a debate about what kind of country Americans want to be. Exceptionalism becomes dangerous when it is used to excuse. It becomes noble when it is used to demand more of ourselves than we demand of others. The choice between entitlement and responsibility is not made once in history. It is made every generation, sometimes every election, sometimes every crisis. And perhaps that is the most American thing of all: the belief that the future is not fate, that the nation is not finished, and that the promise can still be kept, if people decide it matters enough to keep it.